Again, my name is Alice Hughes from the Division of Neurology Products at the FDA, and I've been asked to speak about changes in the incidence of PML in Tysabri-treated patients and how best to communicate to patients and physicians. And I'll start off by saying that I don't have the answer of how best to communicate to patients and physicians, but I'll talk about what we've done, and I hope at the end of our session to have some more communication about how best we can communicate information. And I'll start by saying that my talk will be narrowly focused on the incidence of PML because that's what I was asked to speak about. But I think this topic of communication is something that obviously applies much more broadly. Just by way of background, which you've heard from Dr. Katz and others, when Tysabri was reintroduced to the market in 2006 for multiple sclerosis, we did not know what the incidence of PML would be in the post-marketing setting. We had the data from clinical trials. There were 3 cases out of, 2 cases out of 1,869 patients who were treated for multiple sclerosis, and 1 case out of approximately 1,000 patients in the Crohn's disease trials. The MS patients were both on concomitant beta interferon therapy, and the Crohn's disease patient had very recent treatment with azathioprine. The risk based on that data at the time, PML was roughly estimated to be 1 in 1,000, but we recognized that we really didn't know what the incidence would be. Specifically, we approved Tysabri, as you've heard, for monotherapy. We didn't know what the risk would be in the monotherapy setting. We hoped that it would be much lower. We also did not know what the risk would be with long-term treatment. The median duration of treatment in the MS trials was 120 weeks. It was shorter in the Crohn's disease trials, I believe. Since marketing reintroduction, we've been getting expedited reports of all new cases and regular updates of PML incidents according to duration of exposure. And we get updates for both the United States and the rest of the world. And the TOUCH program, which you've heard extensively about from Dr. Katz, places us in the unique position of having reliable numerator, the number of PML cases, and denominator information, the number of patients treated according to exposure duration. And as Dr. Katz mentioned, we really don't have this for most of the adverse events for the other drugs that we have in our division. So it places us, it gives us the ability and the responsibility to communicate this information to patients and physicians. We've learned a number of things about PML incidence since 2006 when Tysabri was placed back on the market after the discovery of the initial PML cases. We've discovered that the risk for PML is not limited to patients receiving Tysabri with other immunomodulatory medications or with very recent history of such, as was the case with the Crohn's disease patient in the clinical trial. We've learned that the risk increases with increasing durations of exposure to Tysabri, and we've learned that the risk of PML is increased in patients who have a history of immunosuppressant treatment prior to Tysabri therapy. And as you've heard, we're still assessing the role of anti-JCV antibody in terms of the influence on risk for PML. So given what we've learned, how do we best communicate what we've learned and the latest information to patients and physicians? And our overarching principle over this time has been that it is important to communicate important new information related to PML incidence as we learn it, or as close to it as reasonable, so patients and physicians can make informed decisions about Tysabri treatment in the context of an individual patient's illness. So that's our principle, but what forum or what fora is our best? How much quantitative information is really useful to patients and physicians? And if quantitative information is useful, how do we best express the incidence quantitatively? What's most informative? What's most understandable? Are different presentations understandable to different people? More understandable to different people or stakeholders. So in the remainder of this talk, I'll just talk, I'm going to talk about the history of our communications related to PML incidence over time since 2006. And I'm going to focus on the 2 key risk communication tools that we've used, the first being the labeling changes that we've made, the second being drug safety communications, which I'll discuss when I get to that part of my talk. And then I'll just end very briefly with some unanswered questions, of which there are many. So in June 2006, this was the part of the Tysabri labeling related to the incidence of PML. It describes the cases in the clinical trial setting and states the absolute risk for PML in patients treated with Tysabri cannot be precisely estimated, and factors that might increase an individual patient's risk for PML have not been identified. And everything in the label that I quote is from the warning section, section 5.1, related to Tysabri and the PML risk. And there still is in the label that's currently approved the clinical trial information, and we've added to it as we've learned more about PML incidence. In August 2008, the label was updated after we received the first post-marketing case reports, of which I believe two were described. We received 2 cases around that period of time. It might have been 3, I believe it was 2. The label at that time was updated to state that additional cases of PML had been reported in the post-marketing setting in patients with multiple sclerosis not taking other immunomodulatory therapy. So the important thing about these 2 cases, the first in the post-marketing setting to us, was that they were occurring in the monotherapy setting, and we hadn't been certain that there was going to be a risk for PML in that setting. We didn't give the number of cases when we updated the label, as we are aware that if we did, we'd need to keep updating the label. And we stated at that time the relationship between the risk of PML and the duration of treatment is unknown, but most cases of PML were in patients who received more than 1 year of treatment. And as you know, the first cases emerged roughly 2 years after Tysabri was reintroduced to the market. So in January 2010, we had our next significant label change related to PML incidence. And it was updated, the label was at that time updated with information about the link between exposure duration and PML risk that we had concluded was present. And at that time, we still thought that the risk of PML in patients treated for 2 years or more was approximately 1 in 1,000. So we decided to communicate that in the label, not by giving the precise number, as again, we thought that the incidence was subject to change and we didn't have a stable estimate. So we wrote in the label, the risk of developing PML increases with longer treatment duration, and for patients treated for 24 to 36 months is generally similar to the rates seen in clinical trials. There is limited experience beyond 3 years of treatment. And we gave the 24 to 36 month interval because we didn't have much experience at that time beyond 36 months. So after this labeling change was made, additional data accumulated which showed that the PML risk in patients treated for 2 years or more was becoming greater, as you've seen, than the run rate of 1 in 1,000 that we had estimated from clinical trials. And we had accumulated enough data for treatment beyond 3 years to give risk estimates for treatment beyond 3 years. So the 24 to 36 months cited in the label was no longer up to date. And there was a growing desire, which you've heard about both internally and externally, for transparency about PML incidence information. And the label to us came to seem like the best repository for this information, as it was readily accessible to both patients and physicians. We also felt, as we were accumulating more data, that there was an increasing need to give more quantitative risk information according to exposure duration. And the general statement comparing the risk observed to the rates observed in clinical trials no longer seemed sufficient. So in April of 2011, relatively recently, we updated the label with 2 important things. One was the information that the risk of PML is also increased in patients who have been treated with an immunosuppressant, not including prior treatment with short courses of corticosteroids prior to receiving Tysabri. We did not cite in the label an estimate of the magnitude of risk increase conferred by such prior treatment. We also added this table to the label, which actually gives incidence information according to duration of therapy. And we give the incidence per 1,000 patients, and this is worldwide data. We decided not to separate it out between the United States and Europe. And we cited incidence in patients treated for up to 24 infusions, which you've heard is around the inflection point at which we see an increase in the risk for PML for patients treated from 25 to 36 infusions and patients who received 37 to 48 infusions. And it's cut off at 48 infusions because We don't have much data beyond that point. And the label states that the data are current as of January 2011 and that data beyond 4 years of treatment are limited. Another aspect of the labeling changes that we've done that I should mention is the medication guide. And this is a part of the approved label that's written directly to patients that presents key risk information. We do not have much benefit information in our medication guide, and you've heard some of the issues about that. And the medication guides have to be given to patients at every Tysabri infusion, and that's part of it's a requirement of the TOUCH program. The medication guide revisions have generally accompanied our other labeling changes. They're an opportunity to communicate directly to patients, of which we at the FDA have few. They're an information about, and this is the information about PML incidence, incidence specifically that's currently in the medication guide. The medication guide is obviously much longer than this with a lot of other information. But the medication guide states your chance of getting PML increases with a longer period of Tysabri treatment and if you have received medicines that can weaken your immune system prior to starting Tysabri. And there's no quantification of incidence in the medication guide. So I'm going to talk just very briefly about our drug safety communications. And drug safety communications are the primary risk communication tool used at the FDA. And they provide information to both patients and healthcare professionals in a standardized format. There's a summary, there's a section specifically written to patients, a section targeted to healthcare professionals, and then a more detailed summary of the data. And we've issued 3 drug safety communications related to Tysabri since 2006. And as you can see, they've paralleled our labeling changes. And they generally announce our labeling changes and give information about the background of the labeling changes. They provide more detail and supportive data compared to the label in general. And in the drug safety communications, we've communicated the number of PML cases and the number of patients treated, which we don't do in the label, obviously, because that's going to become updated very quickly. And I'm not going to really go through what we've stated in the drug safety communications because it's very similar to what I just went through in terms of our labeling changes. One thing I will mention is that we did, in the April 2011 drug safety communication, include a brief description of our new data presentation format, which I'm going to talk a little bit about in the next slide as well. And the drug safety communication stated, FDA believes that presenting PML incidents for discrete intervals of treatment instead of showing cumulative risks above certain thresholds of exposure will allow prescribers to better assess risk based on duration of treatment and will aid healthcare professionals in discussing the risk of PML with their patients. And this is sort of what I'm talking about, and this is 2 different data presentations of PML incidents using our most current data. So this is based on the 145 cases that you've heard about through July 5th. Now, I guess we have more recent information that there are now 149 cases. They're not included here. So the presentation that you'll see on the left is the one that we had initially been using in our earlier drug safety communications. But we've moved in the label, as you saw a few slides back, to the presentation on the right. So the presentation on the left shows risk according to cumulative durations of exposure. So the risk in patients treated for 2 years or more, which is a risk that's frequently quoted, is now about 3 in 1,000. But we, after a lot of thought and comparing the different incidence presentations, decided that it might be more useful to patients and physicians actually to present incidence of PML according to discrete intervals of exposure. So what's the risk of PML in patients treated for 25 to 36 months? You can see that's 1.9 per thousand now. What's the risk in patients treated for 37 to 48 months? That's now 1.3 per thousand. So we've decided that the presentation on the right is more clinically useful for assessing an individual patient's risk at a given point in time and in discussing risk over time with patients. But we really don't know if that's the case. We don't know which presentation is more understandable to patients and physicians, although we hope that it's the presentation on the right, as that's what's in the label. And as you can see, we've limited the incidence presentation to one known risk factor, duration of therapy. as we think that risk over time is important for ongoing treatment decisions. As known risk factors accumulate, however, this table may grow more complex and unwieldy, and at that point, its utility may increase. At that point, perhaps it'll become difficult to interpret, or some combination. So I'd just like to summarize just this part of my talk, and I'm almost finished, by discussing the historical trends I see in the communications that we've issued on PML incidence. I think we've moved towards greater transparency regarding incidence information. We've moved towards placing more granular incidence information in the label itself. We've moved towards presenting more quantitative information about PML incidence, and within the quantitative realm, we've moved from presenting the risk according to cumulative durations of exposure to presenting PML risk according to discrete intervals of exposure. We've also moved towards a tabular presentation of quantitative risk from a descriptive text. And I should mention that, you know, as we've gotten more specific in our communications about PML incidence, that leads to the need for frequent updates as information becomes quickly outdated. And when we decided that we'd put the table in the label with the PML incidence information, we decided that we'd update it approximately yearly, but more often if there were substantial changes in incidence that we felt needed to be communicated. And I'd just like to end with a number of unanswered questions. And I'm not going to attempt to answer them. I'll just enumerate some of them. So I think it's an open question what this incidence information means to patients and physicians. How do they integrate PML incidence information into their treatment decisions? How do they process risk? What do these incidence numbers mean to patients in terms of their assessment of their individual risk for getting PML? What's a regulatory agency's role in disseminating real-time or close to real-time incidence information for an adverse event? Are we over-communicating? Are we under-communicating incidence information? Are we providing necessary context to this risk information? Are we providing enough information about benefit? The drug safety communications sort of in format are focused on risk, and there's not really a place for benefit information. Is that really appropriate? We've not assessed the effect of our communications on patient or physician understanding of risk. Once the TOUCH program, though, is approved as a formal risk evaluation and mitigation strategy, mandatory assessments of understanding will be included, and I think that will provide really valuable information. What else should we be doing about communicating information about PML incidence and about other risk information? What other forms of communication should we be using? Who else can and should be productively involved? How much granularity should be in the label itself? I'm wondering if there's another forum that should serve as a repository for up-to-date incidence information. I wonder if patients and physicians will think to look at the label for the latest incidence information. Is there a role for a website? Should it be on the Tisabri.com website, since people may think to check that, but there's promotional information on that website. Is that an appropriate place? And then I think one of the biggest questions is what's an acceptable level of PML risk, and that's certainly not a question I'm going to answer, but food for thought. And that ends my presentation.